It was a night of glitter and power. The world's richest and most influential people gathered inside the Crystal Pavilion, a private gala known only to billionaires and the elite. Cameras flashed, champagne flowed, and laughter echoed under the golden chandeliers. At the center of it all stood Victor Lang, a self-made tech billionaire worth over $40 billion. Known for his arrogance and love for public humiliation, Victor had one signature tradition. Every year, he'd challenge his guests with impossible riddles, just to prove no one could outthink him. That night, among movie stars, CEOs, and politicians, one man stood quietly in the corner, Steven Seagal. Dressed in a simple black suit, his long hair tied back, he wasn't there for attention. He observed the room with calm, steady eyes, unmoved by the luxury or noise. Victor noticed him and smirked. Well, the action star himself. Tell me, Mr. Seagal, do you solve problems the same way you solve fights? The crowd chuckled. Steven simply smiled, his expression unreadable. Victor waved his hand dramatically. I'll make it interesting, he said, pulling out a small golden card from his pocket. This riddle has stumped professors and geniuses alike. If you can solve it, I'll give you anything you want. Gasps rippled through the room. The offer sounded outrageous, but Victor loved the spotlight, and loved even more when people failed in front of him. Steven raised an eyebrow. Anything? He asked quietly. Victor nodded with a grin. Anything. Your choice. The audience began whispering, phones out, ready to capture the moment. Some expected Steven to refuse, or after all, this wasn't his world. Others hoped he'd try and fail, just so they could laugh with the billionaire. But Steven Seagal didn't flinch. He placed his glass down gently on the table and said in his calm, deep voice, All right, Victor, let's hear it. The crowd grew silent. Even the band stopped playing. Victor smirked, holding the golden card high. Then listen carefully, he said, because what I'm about to ask has never been solved before. No one expected Steven's next words to leave a billionaire speechless. The chandelier's glow flickered over the hushed audience as Victor Lang lifted the golden card between his fingers, like a magician about to perform. His smile was smug, his voice loud enough for every corner of the grand ballroom to hear. Here's the riddle, he said dramatically. I speak without a mouth and hear without ears. I have no body, but I come alive with the wind. What am I? A few people chuckled nervously. It sounded poetic but confusing. Some guests whispered guesses. Others pulled out their phones to look clever, pretending to think deeply. But Victor already knew the outcome. He'd used this riddle before and no one had ever solved it. He turned slowly toward Steven Seagal, who stood motionless near the table, arms calmly folded. The billionaire tilted his head. So, Mr. Action Hero, what do you think? Still want to play this game? Steven didn't answer right away. He just looked at him in steady, unreadable, unbothered. His silence made Victor uneasy, though he'd never admit it. Victor laughed loudly, trying to break the tension. Oh, come on. Don't tell me the great Steven Seagal's gone speechless. What's the matter? No stunt double to think for you this time? The crowd erupted in laughter. A few guests clapped, feeding Victor's ego, but not everyone was amused. Some could sense Seagal's calm wasn't weakness. It was focus. Steven placed his hands behind his back, taking a small step forward. I didn't come here to play games, he said in a low, even tone. But when a man puts his pride above wisdom, someone needs to remind him where real strength lies. The laughter died instantly. Victor's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. Oh, really? Then by all means enlighten me, Master of Wisdom, he sneered. Steven didn't react. He simply said, Not yet. Let the others try first. Victor nodded smugly. Fine. Let's see who's smarter than Hollywood's toughest man. He pointed to a group of guests, investors, socialites, and tech CEOs. They threw out random answers. Echo? Air? Sound? Victor rejected each one with theatrical flair, pretending to think deeply before mocking them. No. You're all missing it, he declared, laughing. See, that's why I'm the billionaire and you're not. The audience laughed again, though this time fewer people joined in. Some were starting to feel the arrogance cut a little too deep. Through it all, Steven remained still. His eyes moved only once, toward a waiter standing quietly at the edge of the room, nervous but curious. The waiter had been listening closely, mouthing the words of the riddle as if trying to solve it himself. Steven gave him a subtle nod as though to say, Keep thinking. Victor snapped his fingers at Steven again. All right, tough guy. You've had time. Do you have an answer? Or should I add your name to the list of failures tonight? Steven's deep voice broke the heavy silence. You enjoy making people look small, Victor. But remember, pride always makes the smart man foolish. Victor laughed. Is that your answer? No, Steven replied calmly. That's a lesson. The line hit like a slap of silence. Even the band stopped mid-song. Victor rolled his eyes, trying to recover the mood. Cute philosophy. But this isn't a kung fu movie. This is the real world. And here I always win. Steven glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of the onlookers, the scholars, the businessmen, the curious strangers who didn't know what to think of him yet. His expression was calm, yet his presence filled the room like a storm waiting to break. Winning means nothing if you lose yourself to arrogance, he said softly. The crowd was torn. Some clapped quietly. Others looked away, not wanting to anger Victor. Victor leaned closer, his voice dripping with challenge. Then prove it, solve it, and I'll give you anything you want. Money, power, my private jet. Name it, the crowd gasped again. It was an absurd promise, one only a billionaire could make and believe. Steven didn't answer. He just smiled faintly and picked up his drink again, taking a slow sip. You really want me to solve this? He asked. That's the deal, Victor snapped. Steven nodded once. Then I'll answer it when the moment's right. Victor threw his hands up, pretending to laugh it off. Oh, of course. When the moment's right, he mocked. Ladies and gentlemen, the man who refuses to answer a simple question. Laughter filled the air again, but this time it was thinner, forced. A few people weren't laughing at all. They were watching Steven closely, sensing something powerful beneath that quiet composure. He looked directly at Victor and said, Sometimes, the silence before the answer is what teaches the loudest men their greatest lesson. Victor frowned. And what's that supposed to mean? Steven gave a calm, knowing look. You'll understand soon enough. The billionaire blinked, confused, and for the first time that night a trace of doubt flickered across his face. Do you think Steven should walk away or accept the challenge right now? Comment below, and tell us which country and city you're watching from. The night dragged on. The laughter, the whispers, the faint music. Everything felt like background noise now. Victor Lang was enjoying his spotlight, soaking in the attention. Guests had returned to their drinks, yet everyone's eyes flicked toward Steven Seagal every few seconds. He hadn't moved much since Victor's last jab, just stood there with his arms crossed, eyes half closed as if deep in meditation. But behind that calm exterior, something in Steven's demeanor began to change. Victor clinked his glass with a fork and announced, Ladies and gentlemen, it seems our special guest prefers to stay silent. Perhaps Hollywood wisdom isn't built for logic. The crowd laughed again, though their amusement was starting to sound nervous. Steven finally opened his eyes. Victor, he said quietly, you still think your riddle makes you smarter than everyone here? The billionaire smirked. Of course. No one's ever solved it. Steven nodded slightly. That's because you don't understand it yourself. The room froze. Victor blinked. Excuse me? Seagal stepped forward, his movements deliberate, slow, controlled, like a man stepping into the center of a dojo. His presence seemed to silence the entire ballroom. You ask a question to test others, Steven said, but a wise man asks to learn. You never wanted an answer, and you wanted applause. A quiet murmur rippled through the guests. Victor's confident grin faltered just a bit, but he masked it with a laugh. That's a nice speech, Steven, but it still doesn't solve the riddle, does it? Steven tilted his head. You're right. Let's fix that. He took a step closer, his voice calm but deep, commanding. You said, I speak without a mouth and hear without ears. I have no body, but I come alive with the wind. Everyone leaned in. The answer, Steven said, pausing briefly, is an echo. Silence. For a moment, even Victor didn't react. The answer hit him like a whisper in the dark. He blinked twice, mouth slightly open, unsure whether to laugh or respond. Then a scholar seated nearby, an older man with silver hair and glasses, stood up slowly and said, He's right. All eyes turned toward him. The scholar continued, It's an old riddle, ancient even. The answer is echo. It speaks without a mouth, hears without ears, and exists only when sound bounces back, just like the wind carries it. Gasps spread through the crowd. Guests looked at each other, amazed. Victor's jaw tightened. No, that can't be. That's too simple. Steven smiled faintly. Sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest for proud men to accept. The billionaire looked around, hoping someone would back him up. No one did. In fact, a few guests started applauding softly, unsure if it was safe to celebrate. Victor's face reddened. You must have heard that before. Steven's reply was smooth and firm. No, Victor. I just listened to the world more than I talked to it. The words landed heavy. Victor's arrogance began to crumble in front of hundreds of eyes. He laughed nervously, trying to shift the energy. Well, even if you guessed it, that doesn't prove anything. Anyone can memorize a riddle. Steven set his drink down and said, Then maybe I should give you one. The crowd perked up instantly. Victor blinked. What? You said you'd give me anything I wanted, Steven reminded him. But before I choose, let me test your wisdom. Now he was the one controlling the room. Victor crossed his arms defensively. Go on then, Steven said softly. Tell me this, Victor. What's more dangerous than a man with a weapon? The billionaire hesitated. Another man with a bigger weapon. Steven shook his head slowly. No, it's a man who thinks he doesn't need one. A few people gasped. Others whispered. It wasn't just an answer, it was a mirror. Victor stared at him, unable to form a response. For the first time all night, he looked small. You fight with pride, Steven continued, not purpose. You mistake arrogance for intelligence, but they're nothing alike. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause. The room that once echoed with laughter now buzzed with respect. Victor's hand trembled slightly as he raised his glass, forcing a smile. All right, I'll admit that was impressive. Steven gave a slight bow of his head. I didn't come here to impress you. I came to remind you, Victor blinked. Remind me of what? Steven looked him dead in the eye. That wisdom doesn't shout, it whispers. Just like an echo. If you were in Steven's place, would you have answered the riddle or walked away and let the billionaire embarrass himself? Tell us in the comments and then type yes if you'd stand up for yourself like Steven did. The ballroom felt different now. The once arrogant buzz of laughter had turned into tense silence, as if the chandeliers themselves were holding their breath. Victor Lang, the billionaire genius, the man used to controlling every conversation, suddenly looked like a schoolboy caught cheating on his own test. He tried to recover, forcing a smug grin. All right, Steven, you've got a sharp tongue and a calm head, but let's be honest, that was a lucky guess. Steven Seagal didn't flinch. His expression stayed as still as a mountain. Luck is what people blame when they meet someone who's prepared, he replied softly. The line landed like a quiet thunderclap. A few people at the front chuckled under their breath, trying to hide their smiles. Victor's face stiffened. He gestured toward the stage. Well, since you're so wise, why don't you come up here and enlighten us all, Mr. Philosopher? Steven slowly made his way to the small platform. Every step felt deliberate, smooth, precise, grounded in calm confidence. He wasn't walking to prove anything. He was walking to teach something. When he reached the center of the stage, he turned to face the crowd, not as a performer, but as a man with purpose. You know, Steven began, I've met many powerful people. They measure strength in numbers, dollars, or applause, but true power doesn't need an audience. The audience leaned in. Even the music had stopped. Power, he continued, is when you can destroy someone and choose not to. That line hit Victor like a strike to the chest. His smirk faded completely. The crowd began to murmur. Someone whispered, That's deep. Steven turned his gaze directly toward Victor. You tried to humiliate me for your own amusement. But I don't take offense, because what you tried to test in me, I already mastered in myself. Restraint. The billionaire swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening. He hadn't expected to be dissected like this, not by an actor, not by a man he underestimated. Trying to save face, Victor laughed weakly. You talk like a monk, Steven. Maybe you should have joined a temple instead of Hollywood. Steven smiled slightly. Discipline isn't about where you train. It's about why you train. Then, to everyone's surprise, Steven turned toward the guests and said, May I share something with you all? The crowd nodded eagerly. He took a slow breath and began. When I was young, my sensei told me, a man who must prove he's powerful is already weak. That lesson took me decades to understand. Because power, real power, isn't shown through dominance. It shone through balance. The crowd was now completely silent. Even Victor couldn't look away. Steven then looked back at him and said, "You built your empire on pride, Victor. You challenge others to prove you're better. But one day you'll find someone who doesn't need your money, your praise, or your stage." Victor's jaw tightened again. "And what happens then?" Steven stepped closer, not threatening, but calm and firm. "Then you'll realize the only thing you truly owned was your ego, and once it's gone, you'll have nothing left." A stunned hush swept across the room. You could hear the sound of glasses being set down, the faint shuffle of nervous movements. Victor stared at him, eyes flickering with anger and confusion. He wanted to respond, to say something clever, to reclaim control, but no words came. Seagal turned away from him and addressed the audience again. "The riddle you asked wasn't about knowledge. It was about reflection. The echo isn't just sound, it's life. Whatever you send out comes back. Arrogance sends humiliation. Respect returns peace." People started nodding. A few began to clap, softly at first, then louder until it filled the room. Victor's assistants looked uncomfortable. Some of his business partners even joined the applause, unwilling to side with a man who had just been stripped of his pride on stage. Victor finally spoke, his voice low and bitter. "You think you've taught me something tonight, Steven?" Steven looked at him, eyes gentle but unshaken. "No, Victor. Life will teach you. I just gave you a preview." The line hit so hard the applause stopped for a second, only to resume stronger than before. Victor tried to hide his humiliation behind a forced smile, but everyone could see it. The crowd had shifted. The man who once owned the room now stood in its shadow. Steven gave a small nod to the crowd, stepped down from the stage, and began walking toward the exit. The guests parted like water, giving him space, not out of fear but respect. And as he reached the doors, he turned slightly, glancing back one last time. "Remember, Victor, some people chase echoes their whole life but never realize the sound came from their own voice." He walked out. The door closed. Silence lingered, thick, heavy, and unforgettable. Victor stood frozen, glass still in hand, unable to say a word. The echo of Steven's final sentence seemed to bounce around the room, haunting him like the riddle itself. What do you think? Did Steven go too far, or did the billionaire deserve that lesson? Comment your opinion below and tell us what city and country you're watching from. The next morning, the sun poured through the glass walls of Victor Lang's mansion like a spotlight exposing guilt. He hadn't slept. The billionaire who used to command rooms with ease was now pacing across marble floors, haunted by one man's calm voice. Some people chase echoes their whole life. Those words refused to leave his head. Victor slammed a fist against his desk. "No one embarrasses me like that and walks away clean," he muttered. But deep down it wasn't just humiliation that burned. It was curiosity. He needed to understand how a man so calm, so unbothered, could dismantle his arrogance without even raising his voice. So he called one of his assistants. "Find Steven Seagal. I want to invite him to my private retreat. Tell him it's for a peace offering." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, are you sure?" "After last night, just do it," Victor snapped. 2 days later, Steven arrived at Victor's private island estate, calm as ever, dressed simply in black, a faint smile on his face. He stepped out of the helicopter and nodded politely. Victor greeted him with exaggerated charm. "Mr. Seagal, glad you could make it. No hard feelings about the party, I hope?" Steven looked at him quietly for a moment, then smiled. "Hard feelings only exist where pride lives, Victor. I left mine behind a long time ago." Victor chuckled awkwardly. "Still the philosopher, I see. Come, I have something to show you." He led Steven to a large open field surrounded by cliffs overlooking the ocean. A few men were setting up a strange mechanical puzzle. Gears, metal plates, and digital locks all fused into one giant contraption. Victor spread his arms proudly. "This, my friend, is the Lang cipher. A machine I designed myself. It can only be unlocked by solving a sequence of logic riddles and mechanical tasks." Steven studied it briefly, saying nothing. Victor smirked. "If you can solve this, Steven, I'll give you anything you want. A jet, a villa, money, you name it." The crowd of technicians and staff who'd gathered nearby murmured with excitement. They all knew Victor wasn't playing fair. He wanted to humiliate Steven again, to prove the last encounter was a fluke. Steven finally spoke. And if I choose not to play? Victor raised an eyebrow. Then you walk away again. But this time everyone will know you were afraid. Steven looked out toward the ocean. The waves crashed below, rhythmic and timeless. Then he turned back and said quietly, I don't fear failure, Victor. But I do pity those who define themselves by it. The billionaire ignored the remark and motioned toward the machine. Let's begin. For the next hour, Steven observed the cipher. He didn't rush, didn't panic, didn't even ask for help. He just watched. The turning of the gears, the flickering lights, the patterns repeating. Victor crossed his arms, amused. You look calm for someone with no idea what he's doing. Steven glanced at him. When the mind is still, the answer appears, the assistants whispered among themselves. Minutes later, Steven pressed a single lever, one no one had touched before. The entire mechanism shifted. Hidden compartments began to move, gears aligning, panels unlocking one after another. Victor's smug smile began to fade. Wait, what did you... Steven interrupted softly. Sometimes the secret isn't in solving every part. It's in understanding what doesn't need to be touched. The machine clicked once more, and stopped. A green light blinked. The lock opened, gasps erupted from the onlookers. The impossible puzzle, unsolved for years, had just been cracked in minutes. Victor's face went pale. Steven turned toward him calmly. You built something complex to prove you were intelligent. But complexity doesn't equal mastery, Victor. Simplicity. That's where truth hides. Victor stared at the open mechanism, speechless. How did you know? Steven smiled. Because everything you design carries your ego. And ego always leaves a pattern. You just have to see it. The billionaire took a shaky breath, struggling to process what had just happened. Steven continued, You see, Victor, you don't need another riddle or invention to prove your worth. You need silence. You need humility. When you learn to quiet your need for validation, you'll finally hear life's real answers. The ocean wind blew gently, as if echoing the lesson. Victor's voice cracked. I don't understand how you can stay so calm. Don't you ever want to prove yourself? Steven looked out at the sea again. When you truly know who you are, you stop trying to prove it to anyone else. Victor's shoulders sagged. The fight had left him. For the first time, the arrogant billionaire looked vulnerable. Not angry, not defensive, just lost. Steven placed a hand on his shoulder. You have everything, Victor, except peace, and no amount of wealth can buy that. Victor's eyes filled with emotion he didn't understand. For the first time, he didn't have an answer, a defense or a witty remark. He simply nodded. Steven turned to leave, his footsteps soft against the stone path. As he reached the helicopter, Victor called out, Wait! You never told me what you want in return. Steven paused, looking back one last time. Keep your promise, he said. But not to me, to yourself. Be a better man than the one who tried to test me. The helicopter lifted off slowly, the wind from its blades whipping through Victor's hair. He watched Steven disappear into the horizon, the man who had everything yet asked for nothing. And for the first time in years, Victor Lang felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Humility. What would you have asked for if a billionaire offered you anything after a challenge? Comment below and type peace if you believe some lessons are worth more than money. Days turned into weeks. News of Victor Lang's Seagal challenge had spread like wildfire. Someone had secretly recorded the entire scene. The machine, the crowd, and the moment Steven Seagal calmly cracked the impossible cipher. The video hit the internet and exploded overnight. Billionaire humbled by Steven Seagal in seconds. Arrogant tycoon learns a lesson from a martial arts master. Within days, Victor Lang's name was trending worldwide, but not for innovation or success. For arrogance. At first, he tried to control the narrative. His PR team released statements calling it a fun exchange between friends, but the world wasn't buying it. Memes spread, articles multiplied, and interviews replayed Seagal's words again and again. When you truly know who you are, you stop trying to prove it to anyone else. Those words echoed louder than any machine Victor had ever built. The billionaire locked himself in his penthouse for days, shutting off calls and meetings. The mirror became his enemy. Every reflection reminded him of the man Steven had exposed. Then one night, unable to sleep, Victor replayed the video again. He watched himself laugh, mock, and belittle, and saw what everyone else had seen. Pride without purpose. His own arrogance stared back at him like a stranger. He shut the laptop and sat silently in the dark. For the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like truth. The next morning, Victor made a decision that shocked his board of directors. He canceled 3 major luxury projects and redirected millions toward education and community development. "We'll build something that lasts longer than my name," he said simply. The executives protested. "Sir, that's not profitable." Victor smiled faintly. "Neither is pride." Word spread quickly. Victor Lang, the once arrogant billionaire, was turning philanthropist. Some thought it was PR damage control. Others saw something different in his tone, a rare sincerity. He began visiting schools, meeting young inventors, and talking about ethics, not ego. Cameras followed him at first, expecting a publicity stunt, but after a while, even they lost interest, and because Victor wasn't performing anymore. He was listening. At one school in Manila, a group of students showed him a robotics project built from recycled metal. Their leader, a shy boy of 15, said softly, "We learned from your video not to give up when people laugh." Victor's eyes softened. "Then maybe the lesson was worth it," the boy smiled. "Steven Seagal said humility is strength." Victor nodded slowly. He was right. Later that month, Victor decided to find Steven again, not for a rematch, but to thank him. He flew to Japan, where Seagal was teaching at a dojo on the outskirts of Osaka. No cameras, no entourage, just Victor in a simple jacket, carrying no gift but gratitude. When he entered the dojo, Steven was in the middle of teaching young students. His movements were slow, graceful, almost meditative. When class ended, Steven approached him with a calm smile. "Victor Lang," he said, as if he already knew why he was there. Victor bowed his head slightly. "You were right about me, Steven. I was chasing echoes. I just didn't know how to stop." Steven nodded. "You stopped the moment you began listening," Victor sighed. "I wanted to thank you. I've changed my life, but it started because you didn't humiliate me, even when you could have." Steven smiled faintly. "Wisdom isn't meant to break a man, Victor. It's meant to rebuild him." Victor looked around the dojo. "I've spent my whole life building machines, but never peace. You did both in one moment." Steven chuckled softly. "That's because machines follow commands. Peace follows humility." The 2 men sat down on the wooden floor. For a moment they said nothing, just shared silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. Victor finally said, "There's one thing I still don't understand. You could have taken anything I offered that day. Money, power, fame. Why didn't you?" Steven looked at him gently. "Because everything you offer fades. But what I gave you, that lasts forever." Victor blinked, stunned by the simplicity of the answer. For a long moment they sat in quiet reflection. The sound of wind brushing through the paper doors filled the space like an echo of truth. Finally, Steven stood and offered his hand. "The test is over, Victor. The rest is practice." Victor took his hand firmly. "I'll do my best," Steven nodded. "Don't do your best. Do what's right." "There's a difference." They exchanged a respectful bow, warrior to warrior, student to teacher, though neither said which was which. As Victor stepped outside, the evening sun painted the horizon gold. He looked out over the mountains, feeling lighter than he had in years. The world still called him a billionaire. But for the first time, he felt like a man. Do you believe people like Victor can truly change? Or is arrogance something that never fades? Comment your thoughts below, and tell us where in the world you're watching from, your city and country. Months later, the world saw a very different Victor Lang. The man who once filled headlines with arrogance now appeared on every news outlet for something entirely unexpected, a new global initiative called the Echo Project. Its mission was simple: to teach emotional intelligence, discipline, and humility through mentorship programs, technology, and mindfulness training in underprivileged communities. At the launch event in New York, journalists filled the hall. Everyone expected another spectacle: flashy speeches, expensive suits, and self-praise. But when Victor Lang took the stage, there was no luxury in sight. No golden decor. No entourage. Just a man in a simple black suit, walking with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove. He stood behind the microphone, scanning the crowd quietly before beginning. "A few months ago," he said, "I thought wisdom meant winning. I thought being the smartest man in the room meant I was powerful. He paused, his voice steady but humble. Then I met someone who reminded me that true strength isn't in proving others wrong. It's in being at peace with yourself. The audience leaned in. Cameras flashed. That man was Steven Seagal. Gasps filled the room. Everyone knew the viral story, but hearing Victor acknowledge it publicly was shocking. He continued. That encounter didn't humiliate me. It liberated me. Because when my ego shattered, I finally saw the truth. I wasn't chasing success, I was running from emptiness. The hall fell silent. The Echo Project exists because of that lesson, Victor said. It's a reminder that whatever you send into the world, pride, anger, kindness, love, and always returns. Just like an echo. He smiled faintly, and sometimes, if you listen closely, that echo carries your redemption. Back in Japan, Steven Seagal watched the live broadcast from a quiet tea room. He sat cross-legged, surrounded by students, his expression calm but proud. One of the young disciples asked, "Sensei, do you think he truly changed?" Steven smiled. A tree bends in the storm or it breaks. Victor bent. That means he's alive. The students nodded, absorbing the lesson. Then Steven added softly, "But remember, humility isn't a one-time victory. It's a daily discipline." A week later, Victor visited a local community center in Los Angeles where children from struggling neighborhoods were learning robotics and meditation, a strange but beautiful mix inspired by his and Steven's encounter. A small girl approached him shyly and said, "Mr. Lang, are you the man from the Steven Seagal video?" Victor laughed gently. "Yes, I am," the girl smiled. "My dad says you were mean, but now you're nice." Victor chuckled. "Your dad's right," she tilted her head. "How did you change?" Victor thought for a moment, then said, "Someone showed me that when you build walls with pride, you block out your own peace. So I stopped building walls and started building bridges." The girl smiled wide. "I want to do that too." Victor knelt down. "Then promise me something. When you grow up, teach others what you learn." That's how the echo keeps going. She nodded and ran back to her group. That evening, as Victor watched the sunset from the same balcony where he once bragged about power and wealth, he whispered to himself. The echo came back, and this time it carried peace. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. It read, "You kept your promise. I'm proud of you." As Victor smiled quietly. For once, there was no need for applause, no spotlight, no validation. The echo had finally returned, not as noise, but as harmony. And somewhere across the ocean, Steven Seagal poured himself a cup of tea, closed his eyes and whispered, "Balance restored." If you believe no amount of wealth is worth your peace, type balance in the comments. And remember, every word, every action, every choice you make echoes back someday.